And there is this craving I see amongst all people for deep, meaningful connection with the people in their lives. And there's nothing lonelier than being in the same room with somebody or being on a call with somebody and speaking around the issues, around the thing that's actually there versus actually connecting, versus being seen, versus being understood, and connecting on that soul level versus talking about the sports or the weather. And sports can be connecting. Laughter is incredibly valuable. I don't mean to diminish that by any means, but if that's the only source of connection, it's missing a very deep underpinning that makes that even richer and more valuable.
Welcome on the Joyful Mate podcast. How are you, Jacob?
I'm doing well, Anthony. How are you?
It's so intriguing that I just had that conversation with you about your preference around how do I call you Jake or Jacob? I call you Jake. No, anyway,
it is my name, so it's all good. There's no way to mess this one up.
No. So, Jake, you've been on my other podcast, the Health Up podcast, and we had a great conversation around modern masculinity. And during that podcast at the time, you were writing a book, and now you've finished the book, and it's a really delight to have you on the Joyful Mate podcast. This podcast is all about helping people find more joy, fulfillment, and happiness. And I'm really keen for you to do that today on the subject matter of masculinity in terms of helping the men out there and helping the women support their men on their journey through better connection. Spoken about connection and the importance of connection and relationships on this podcast. So before we get into our discussion around masculinity, I'd love you to share with the listeners how you've arrived at, I guess, being so passionate about this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. And first, thank you for having me back, or first time on the Joyful Mate podcast. It's great to see you again and get to have another conversation about masculinity and my work in the book. So I never set out to work with men, and I certainly fell into it when a little over 10 years ago, my mentor at the time, Nick Papadopoulos, asked me if I'd write a book with him. And he had run men's groups for 10 years at that point and wasn't a writer and knew that I was, and asked if I would collaborate. I got chills up and down my spine and said, let's do it, having never been in a men's group or really knew what a men's group was. So I joined my first men's group as research for this novel and then was in it for 8 years. And it was through being in the group and working with Nick on the book that I did discover this love of working with men. And in large part, it's because I've been really lucky in my life with the male role models that I've had. I'm very close with my father. I think he is a really good man. And I say that with all the depth of respect in the word good. And I've had coaches over the years, sports coaches, executive coaches who have been really good men. And while a lot of men end up working in men's groups because of a challenging relationship with men, I love doing this work because I want to give men what I was lucky enough to have, which is really solid, wonderful, deep male friendships and male relationships.
Yeah, so you're really being that model, or I guess that role model for the people in the group that didn't have it. So it's nice that you're returning favor or returning that, I guess, privilege that you had growing up, having great role models around you. So just in terms of this whole subject of, you mentioned in the book that we're in a modern masculinity crisis. Can you just speak to that?
Yeah, it's something I've given a lot of thought about over the years. And when I started writing this book in 2016, I had a very different thinking on it than I do today. And anybody out there sees the litany of articles and media about the male masculinity crisis, the friendship crisis amongst men. Lessons was a huge Netflix show last year. There was the new documentary about the manosphere that came out recently, which I will admit I have not seen yet. I will watch it at some point. And it's fascinating because when I started writing this book, that wasn't really in the dialogue. There wasn't so much this conversation about a crisis amongst men. And I think COVID really brought it to the fore because men could no longer spend time with their friends the way they were used to, which was side by side at the bar, at the ball game, playing video games. Everything became virtual, and it really exposed this lack of connection that men were having. Now, I don't think it was COVID that caused that. I think it was happening before, but it did bring it to the surface. And that's when I became much more focused on it and just aware of wow, what I've been working on the past few years is deeply related to what so many people are struggling with right now, particularly men. And at the same time, as I look at the crisis around masculinity, the friendship crisis, the men I'm seeing aren't challenged by it. The men in our groups have deep, meaningful relationships. The men in my coaching practice, I do executive coaching for corporate leaders and personal development for individual clients. They oftentimes have deep, meaningful relationships, or they develop them through the work itself. And I myself, I have a lot of really close male friends. So it's interesting to hear the statistics about this and yet not see it in my day to day life. And at the same time, it clearly is a challenge. And I know that there are a lot of men, particularly in the States here, who feel disenfranchised, who feel like their purpose has been taken away, who are only connecting on online spaces, and how incredibly alienating that can be. So the book that I've written, The Men's Group, A Novel of Messy Friendships, is really about the value and importance that friendship plays for all people, but particularly men, and not just your run-of-the-mill surface level friendship, but the deep, meaningful friendships where you talk about all of the real stuff that's going on in life.
And so, like, because when you read these statistics, like, that we're in a loneliness pandemic at the moment, and it's not necessarily that you don't have friends. You don't. It's more of a feeling, a subjective feeling that you don't feel connected with them. Like there's a sense that, yes, I've got friends, I hang out with and I associate with. And so it's not necessarily that I'm physically lonely, locked up in a room and I've got no one around me or can't contact anyone. People do have people, but it's what you're talking about. It's feeling connected. And you sort of summed up as having a deeply meaningful relationship. So really keen to explore this as to how we break down this perceived barrier or this invisible barrier around feeling disconnected.
You hit the nail on the head in that it's that disconnection that is at the core of this crisis. And there's a great quote, which I'm struggling to remember. It's from a Tennessee Williams play, Camino Real. And it's something like, when so many people are lonely together, something like that. I'm really missing it. I'm going to
Yes.
remember it
Yeah.
when we get off
Yeah.
the phone or this call. But it really speaks to when so many people are lonely, and they're lonely together, they might as well be alone. And there is this craving I see amongst all people for deep, meaningful connection with the people in their lives. And there's nothing lonelier than being in the same room with somebody or being on a call with somebody and speaking around the issues, around the thing that's actually there, versus actually connecting, versus being seen, versus being understood, and connecting on that soul level versus talking about the sports or the weather. And sports can be connecting. Laughter is incredibly valuable. I don't mean to diminish that by any means, but if that's the only source of connection, it's missing a very deep underpinning that makes that even richer and more valuable.
So, like, when I go out and I watch the younger generation, so they're typically sitting together, but they're all on their phones, and so I find as much as they're physically together, they're not together. They're totally disconnected, and so. Is it partially because we don't know how to be present, or we are so distracted that we struggle to our attention span is just not like I'm thinking there's this modern day influence around technology and the fast pace of the world we live in, and but what have you found that's so different between men's groups and when people socialize? I don't know, go out to dinner or go out for drinks. What is it that the men group have, and you feel so deeply connected that these other connection points don't seem to get that same sense of connection?
Yes. In large part, the difference is the intentionality, in that these men show up every 2 weeks and our groups are virtual. So we're showing up on screens in not, I mean, I wish we were in person, but we've got men from all over the nation. So we can't really do it in person every 2 weeks. But there's the intentionality of we're showing up to connect deeply. We're showing up every 2 weeks to have a deeper conversation, to reflect, to be coached, to pull back the layers of our lives and understand ourselves and our challenges a little differently. Versus when people just go out with their friends, they're often not bringing that intentionality of, I want to connect with my friend tonight, or my intention is to create joy and energy and fun. it's this autopilot of, oh, we're going to the bar, we're going to go play video games, or we're going to go to the movie. And our world is filled, as you were alluding to, with so many distractions and so much information that's constantly bombarding us, that part of what I believe is we turn to our phones as a way to numb out from the distraction. I'm not from this distraction, excuse me, to numb out from this bombardment of information. Of course, by bombarding ourselves with more information, but it's a dopamine hit. And that's incredibly challenging because suddenly we're no longer present to what's in our space. But I believe that so many people are uncomfortable that the mere act of being present is so unpleasant that it's easier to tune into a device than to sit in awkward silence with a friend, or to have that conversation you've been putting off, or to recognize maybe I don't want to be spending time with this person at all.
Yeah, there's a couple of things, that you shared with me in the book, and this sort of comes to the point that you're coming to here is this whole thing around vulnerability and being willing to open up. Like I find when I'm in women's circles, or if there's majority women, they're quite happy just, and that's what they'll all each of them will bring problems, and then there's a whole thing of relatability, so that people are trying to relate to that person's problem through an experience they've had, and through that they're saying, or they're essentially saying that what you're experiencing is sort of normal, not really normalize it, but it's sort of saying, well, I've had a shared experience, and this is what happened with me, or this is how I worked through it. And so they're constantly having these sort of conversations, whereas I don't find men sort of bring it to the table. It really needs to be dug out, or many layers. So, like, obviously, you mentioned with the men's group, you have an intention where people do bring their life's problems to the table. And so it's a space for that. How do we create that sort of, and it's probably not easy, right? It's a hard question, but how can men sort of create their own men's groups where they're comfortable sharing and they can open up and talk about issues?
I think it always begins with the tiny little steps versus jumping right in. For example, I have a client, and he's someone who actually would fit very well into this friendship crisis. He has friends, but they are not local. He doesn't spend as much time in person with people as he would like. He feels lonely. He really wants a relationship, but doesn't have one. Very typically, this is what we're seeing in the statistics. And his best friend just moved back to be close to him, and they have a deep friendship. They talk about the hard things, but they're not intentionally doing it. And so one of the things I offered to them was to start sharing gratitude with each other every day. Just three things that they're both grateful for, as a starting point to actually reframe, particularly his mindset around what's working in his world. And see that as just a small step in the direction of intentionality in a relationship. It's we're doing something a little bit different. We're beginning to ritualize something, even if it's a text thread with three things we're both grateful for. So that's one, is take that tiny step in the direction of more vulnerability, in the direction of more honesty. The second thing, and you know this from reading the first couple chapters of our book, is you can say directly to your friends, hey, I'd like to talk about deeper things together. It takes a lot more courage to be that direct and that open and that vulnerable to ask for something more in a friendship, particularly amongst men who tend to rib each other, who make fun of each other, who, when vulnerability comes up, laugh or make jokes to push it aside because the intimacy is uncomfortable. But I'm seeing a lot more men open to those types of conversations and relationships now. And so just by going and saying, hey, I'm struggling with something, can I get your thoughts on it? Or I'd really love to hear what's going on in your world, remembering something they brought up, even if it was a small thing, and asking about it. Just those small moments of vulnerability can build towards more men's group like conversations. And I'll say one more thing, which is I mentioned that what separates the group from hanging out with friends and being on phones over dinner is the intentionality of it. This artificial space, or as a friend of mine likes to call it, when we're facilitating, we create a temporary alternative world where the rules are different than our day-to-day lives. Is as an individual, you can choose to create a temporary alternative world in how you show up. So maybe you bring an intentionality of, I'm going out with dinner with my friends. I'm going to be vulnerable. I'm going to bring up some challenges. I'm going to share some big wins. I'm going to ask different questions. And just that slight change can shift how an interaction goes. Again, it doesn't have to be a full blown men's group to be super valuable. That it's really important to go hang out with your friends and have a good time. And if 25% of that is talking about a challenge that you're having because you were willing to say, hey, I'd love some help with this, that's a big win. And I'll tell you, for those listeners, men love to help. So if you really want to have a deep conversation, starting with that of, I'd like your help with this, is a really useful way to actually enter the conversation.
Yeah, and I think the other one you've touched on there is the language men use versus, if I were to be generalizing here, but like women will sort of say that same thing indirectly, and women understand it. They'll pick it up, but men need that more direct sort of, being straight. Yes, that sort of more straight talking, whereas women can sort of allow it to come up in conversation, but not so impactful, if you sort of get where I'm coming from, that direct versus indirect conversation.
Yeah. So many men really value the directness of things, and they direct advice, direct feedback, just being straight with what you want. I think that's something that a lot of men really value, because men also aren't always so good at picking up on the nuance. And I will actually, you reframe that a bit. I don't know that men aren't so good on picking up on the nuance. I believe it's actually vulnerable to pick up on the nuance. And so a lot of men aren't going to notice, oh, my friend's getting emotional here. I'm not going to say something because I'm uncomfortable. Versus what a woman might do is to notice the emotion and ask a question about it.
So the women more likely to lean in, and not to avoid it. That it more opens the door for them to come in, whereas the men feel uncomfortable with where it might go, and hence have an avoidance tactic. As you said, either make a joke of it and sort of change the subject, or is that more that what happened? Is that the sense that it brings up uneasy feelings within men? Um,
Exactly.
yeah. So, because the other thing you mentioned in the book, or in terms of what you shared with me, was this thing of growth, and that part of this is, it's breaking out of old beliefs and attachments to old paradigms, and really, I guess what we've just touched on here is just more leaning into this, dropping the protectionism, opening up, being more vulnerable in order to allow that conversation to drift into something deeply connecting and meaningful. Have you got some tips as to, I mean, you did mention before that, you got to do it bite size, small pieces, but have you got some insight here as to how men can sort of lean into this growth and move more into these sort of types of conversations, as opposed to put up the wall and avoid it and escape?
Yes, there's so many really good tools for this. And at the highest level, I'm going to bring it back. It's going to sound like being a dead horse, which is to bring that intentionality. That everything begins with an intentionality. And that begins with really actively choosing to work on something. I do a lot of work in a methodology called stakeholder centered coaching, which is all about behavior change. And what it focuses on is choosing one behavior to change. So if you're a man out there, or a woman for that matter, who wants to get better at picking up on the small things or leaning into the vulnerability versus leaning out, you might choose that as your behavior. This is the behavior I'm going to practice for a year. And along with that behavior, you come up with 3 to 5 very key behaviors that fulfill it, which could be like, every time I see a friend getting emotional, I'm going to ask a question. Or when I'm troubled by something, I'm going to say something about it. Or if someone says something that upsets me, I'm going to tell them. And to then create a daily checklist to every day ask the questions. Did I lean into the vulnerability? Did I notice someone's emotion and say something? Did I share if something frustrated me? And to just begin to track, am I following through with these small behaviors that are going to build towards me actually showing up different in the world? And breaking it down into those bite-sized bits and being consistent with it is what can lead to actually shifting someone's experience. Because the key is, and I see this time and time again with my clients, that insight is cheap. That a lot of clients I work with, they'll have an insight, and the insight will be this big moment. Someone will have a big recognition, like, oh, I avoid vulnerability because it's uncomfortable. And then there won't be any follow through to action and act on that insight. That the biggest growth happens for the people who are willing to show up every single day and be honest with themselves about what they're doing and what they're not doing. And the other thing I'll mention specifically around this is, for all of you out there, maybe you don't want to set a daily checklist. Maybe you're not ready for that. Just bring a different level of curiosity to your behaviors, to walk through the world and ask yourself, well, why am I doing that? To notice when you shun vulnerability, or when you don't bring a challenge to your friends, or when you're the one that cuts off the emotional connection versus somebody else, and ask yourself, why did I do that? What's my motivation for doing that under the surface? Because everything we do has a purpose. It's usually a purpose that's very old and from our past and may no longer serve us, but it has a purpose. And we're trying to prove something right about ourselves and about the world. So just by bringing that curiosity of, why am I doing this? Why am I making these choices? Why am I spending time with these people, especially if they're not filling you up? That's one way of taking on your growth in a very different way, because you're, again, bringing it to the surface and bringing this added level of intentionality and following through day after day after day.
Nice. And I think that's a great segue into your book, because obviously you've opened up this curiosity around growth and leaning in and setting that intention. Please share a little bit more about the great book you've written that's been worked on for a very long time and is doing really well out there. So happy for you to just give us a synopsis of the men's group.
Absolutely. So it's called The Men's Group, A Novel of Messy Friendships. It's available as of June 9th on all platforms online. It's been a decade in the making. And The Men's Group is about men. It's about friendship. It's about showing up when it matters most. And it follows the life of this failed New York screenwriter named Darcy Matthews, whose life is in shambles. His career is a mess. His relationship with his girlfriend is on thin ice. His father has terminal cancer. And his best friend keeps hounding him to visit a men's group that he's pretty sure is a cult. And it all goes wrong when his girlfriend breaks up with him and he hangs up the phone on his dying father. And so, out of last straw, out of desperation, he texts his friend and says, fine, I'll visit your men's group. And what begins as this reluctant participation becomes this confrontation with shame, grief, and the stories men tell themselves to survive. And so Darcy begins to develop this ability, or work on this ability, to share honestly. And he confronts the impact of neglecting his relationships as he works alongside the other men in the group, as his best friend, Pat, who convinced him to join in the first place, falls back towards this dark and terrible secret that begins to ruin his entire life. And so the central question of this novel is, will Darcy and Patrick's friendship survive? And it follows the cast of characters in the men's group that Darcy joins, but also his relationships with women in his life, his relationships with family. And so we call it a novel of messy friendships, because it really is this novel of all of these messy relationships that Darcy and the other characters have to confront and work through in order to get where, get where they get. I won't even say get where they want to go.
It sounds like very modern life. Like I guess you've captured through these characters very much the issues that people are grappling with in today's societies. And they'll be able to find it Amazon. You got a website, don't you? Yep.
Yes, amazonbookshop.org. It'll be on barnesandnoble.com. Our website is mensgroupnovel.com. So you'll be able to, again, purchase the book as of June 9th.
And I'll include those links in the show notes for the listeners and viewers. And I just want to thank you, Jake, for coming on and sharing such great insights in terms of connection and how men can more deeply connect. And this also applies to women and in all relationships around that, setting that intention to grow and develop the relationship and put it more effort into building on relationships, because as we know, nothing happens through doing nothing, right? It's sort of, we actually need to put the work in all aspects of life. So thank you once again, Jake. Really appreciate your time.
Absolutely, Anthony. It's been a pleasure to be on with you yet again.
It's great to catch up. It's been many years. And to the listeners, please share it with others that you believe could benefit from Jake's wisdom around connection and building deep, meaningful relationships. Thank you once again for tuning in to another episode of the Joyful Mate podcast.